On August 1st, a single leak did something 5 months of open warfare hadn't managed to do. It exposed exactly how exposed America's Gulf allies really are. CBS News reported that the United States and Israel were preparing one of the harshest bombing campaigns yet against Iran's energy infrastructure, with strikes possible within days. Iran's response wasn't panic. It was a published list of energy facilities across Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE that Iranian missiles could reach if the strikes went ahead. That list mattered for one reason. It named the exact countries that, according to separate reporting, just days later had been quietly negotiating with Israel and Washington to build a secret alternative to the Strait of Hormuz, a backup energy corridor, one most of those governments had never confirmed publicly. Iran didn't need spies inside the Pentagon to figure this out. It just needed to watch who showed up to the meetings. Welcome back to the channel. If you want to understand what's actually happening behind the headlines in this war, not just what the wire services are printing, subscribe and stick around. Let's get into it. Quick context. How we got here. This story starts on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Within hours, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that roughly a fifth of the world's oil and LNG passes through every single day. For the next several weeks, the world watched oil prices spike and European gas prices jump by roughly 20% in a single morning. On March 2nd, an Iranian drone struck Qatar Energy's Ras Laffan facility, forcing an immediate production shutdown. 16 days later, Israel hit Iran's South Pars gas field and the Asaluye refinery complex, wiping out roughly 12% of Iran's total gas production in one strike. The United States coordinated and approved that operation, though Trump would later say he hadn't known the specifics in advance. By late spring, a ceasefire was announced. The White House called it a decisive victory. But by early July, U.S. forces had resumed strikes, and by August 1st, Iran was warning that Washington and Tel Aviv were preparing to go after something they hadn't touched before. Civilian and industrial energy infrastructure, not just military and political targets. That's the moment this story actually begins. The leak. That started everything. According to CBS News, sources familiar with the planning said the U.S. and Israel were preparing to hit Iranian energy infrastructure as soon as the first weekend of August. No final order had been given. Trump reportedly hadn't signed off yet. But the plan itself, according to multiple outlets including Axios and Haaretz, was real, detailed, and close to execution. Iran's response came fast. A senior Iranian security official told the IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency that Tehran considered the American reports reckless and said the country had already prepared what the official described as a comprehensive response plan, one that would target both Israeli infrastructure and American energy assets across the region. Then came the detail that made this more than just another war of words. Fars News, another outlet tied to the IRGC, published an actual list. Energy facilities in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. All of them named as targets Iranian missiles could reach if the strikes on Iran went forward. Here's what nobody connected at the time. That list wasn't just a threat aimed at Israel and its enemies. It was a threat aimed directly at America's own Gulf allies, the same governments that have spent this entire war insisting, at least publicly, that they weren't taking sides. What nobody noticed. The secret corridor. 4 days after that target list went public, Israel Hayom broke a story that had been sitting quietly in diplomatic back channels for weeks. According to that report, Israeli and Gulf officials, with direct U.S. involvement, had been meeting both inside Israel and abroad to build an alternative energy corridor, one designed specifically to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. The plan, as described in the reporting, involves unloading oil tankers at the Saudi port of Yanbu, moving that oil overland to the Israeli port of Eilat, then piping it to Ashkelon for export across the Mediterranean. A longer-term version of the plan would build new pipeline infrastructure connecting the Gulf directly to Jordan's port of Aqaba and from there into Israel. Israel already has a standing arrangement with the UAE to move oil through Eilat under a separate agreement. Think about what that actually means. While Iran was closing the front door, the world's largest energy choke point, the countries most dependent on that door, were quietly building a back door with the one country in the region most hostile to Iran. That's not a small diplomatic footnote. That's a fundamental repositioning. And it explains something that seemed strange at first glance. Why Iran's target list wasn't limited to Israel and the United States. Iran named Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE. The exact governments now tied, however quietly, to the corridor project. Whether Iranian intelligence had detailed knowledge of the Eilat-Ashkelon talks specifically is something we can't confirm. But the overlap between Iran's published target list and the countries involved in the secret corridor discussions is difficult to write off as coincidence. The evidence keeps piling up. This wasn't an isolated week of tension. It was the latest layer on a pattern that had been building since the ceasefire. According to two senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers who spoke to the New York Times and reported by the Institute for the Study of War's Critical Threats Project, the IRGC used the spring ceasefire not to stand down but to coordinate. Quds Force commanders reportedly held direct calls with Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iraqi militia leadership throughout the pause in fighting, laying groundwork to widen the conflict the moment hostilities resumed. On August 1st, that groundwork showed results. Kuwaiti air defenses intercepted a wave of Iranian drones targeting the country directly. The same day, 2 commercial vessels came under attack in the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump, addressing the situation on Fox and Friends, said plainly that he was losing faith in Iran because of what he called their pattern of lying and misrepresenting the situation. Meanwhile, a separate and quietly alarming detail emerged from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. After 5 months of near-continuous combat operations, America's own missile defense stockpiles were running thin. Patriot interceptor inventories had dropped below 1,000 units. THAAD interceptors were down to roughly 250. These aren't abstract numbers. They're the physical limit on how many incoming threats the U.S. and its regional partners can actually stop at once. Put it together. Iran rebuilding its proxy network during the ceasefire. Iran naming Gulf energy infrastructure as fair game. American interceptor stockpiles thinning out after months of continuous use. And underneath all of it, a secret energy bypass being negotiated between Israel, the Gulf, and Washington, one that just became public at the worst possible moment for the countries involved. The counterargument. To be fair to the other side of this, none of this proves the Gulf states made a reckless decision. Building alternative energy infrastructure is a rational hedge for any country whose main export route has been sitting closed since February. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar aren't choosing sides by exploring pipeline alternatives. They're managing basic economic survival in a war that has already cost the region billions. It's also worth noting that Israel already had a functioning oil arrangement with the UAE through Eilat before any of this began, so the corridor talks aren't entirely new. And American officials have not confirmed the full scope of the discussions Israel Hayom described, meaning some details could shift as more reporting comes out. Still, the timing is what makes this dangerous. A hedge that stays private carries little political risk. A hedge that becomes public 2 days before Iran names your energy facilities as a target carries a very different kind of risk, whether or not the two events are formally connected. Real-world consequences. For the Gulf states, the practical fallout is uncomfortable. They now have to manage a relationship with Iran that assumes hostile intent regardless of what they say publicly, because Iran's target list already treats them as participants. At the same time, they can't fully walk away from the corridor talks, because Hormuz remains functionally closed and their economies depend on getting oil to market somehow. For Europe, the picture is different but no less uncomfortable. According to Bruegel's economic analysis, the EU is somewhat insulated compared to Asian buyers, since only around 8% of the bloc's LNG imports come through Qatar via Hormuz. But the European Commission still downgraded its 2026 growth forecast and raised its inflation projection to 3.1%, citing the ongoing disruption. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas made Europe's position clear back in March, stating flatly that the bloc had no appetite to send its navy into the Strait of Hormuz, and that the conflict was, in her words, not Europe's war. The G7 later agreed to help secure Hormuz, but only once the fighting stopped, a condition that, 5 months later, still hasn't been met. So you have 2 blocks of countries, watching from 2 different angles, both discovering the same uncomfortable truth. Neither the Gulf states nor the EU can fully control the situation they're now caught inside. The Gulf states are exposed by a secret plan that just became public. Europe is exposed by a choke point it has no leverage over and no appetite to fight for. What comes next? Watch 3 things over the coming weeks. First, whether Trump gives the final order for the energy infrastructure strikes CBS and Axios both reported were nearly ready to go. If those strikes happen, Iran's published target list stops being a threat on paper and becomes a live question of whether Tehran follows through. Second, watch whether the Eilat-Ashkelon corridor moves from back-channel talks into an actual operating route. If tankers start unloading at Yanbu and that oil starts flowing through Israeli territory at scale, that's the moment the secret part of this story officially ends. And every government involved will have to answer for a decision they spent months trying not to make in public. Third, watch Gulf state messaging closely. If Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE start hedging in their public statements toward Iran, offering assurances, floating diplomatic openings, or distancing themselves from Washington's next move, That's a sign they know exactly how exposed they've become and are trying to manage the fallout before Iran decides to test that target list for real. For months, this war has been framed as a contest between Iran on one side and the US-Israeli coalition on the other, with everyone else standing at a safe distance. That framing never quite held up, and this past week proved it. The Gulf states weren't neutral bystanders. They were quietly building infrastructure with the side they claimed not to be backing. Iran didn't need a spy network to notice. It just published a list. Whether that list turns into actual strikes is still an open question, but the trust it damaged, the assumption that the Gulf states could keep hedging their bets without consequence, is already gone. And once a hidden position becomes a public one, there's no quiet way back. Thanks for watching. If you want the next update on this the moment it breaks, subscribe and turn on notifications, and let me know in the comments which of the 3 developments above you think happens first.